brothers Romney and Dick Cheney and my daddy too. We've been planning it for years of what we're gonna do. We gave money to Osama and the Taliban, and then 9/11 started off a master plan. Let's roll. Let's roll. Gonna get 'em if I'm gonna play the game and score. Well, now I have to make another war.
Hello again, and welcome to another dangerous episode of Forbidden Knowledge. I'm Craig, your host for this next hour, and my job here is to slap you around with knowledge, things you aren't going to learn anywhere else on any kind of TV program or radio for that matter, or newspaper. This is in fact the only reality show on TV because this is where we get the true facts about what's really going on in this country and what you need to know to actually be a proper citizen. Today we're in kind of an ambient setting. We have a small audience here. I'm with a guest. We're in a home of someone in the area. And we don't have any script. My guest, I was going to say my first guest, my guest is Dr. Kevin Berrett. He recently appeared in Ann Arbor 2 different times on 2 different occasions for 911 Truth conferences that were held in Ann Arbor. And he's graciously decided to sit down with me and discuss, I believe we're going to discuss about the Islamic connection with globalization and the anti-globalization movement. But let me first introduce Mr. Kevin Berrett. He is well, why don't I just let you introduce yourself? Tell me your basic background, what makes you qualified to speak on this topic, and who are you?
Well, I'm actually usually introduced as Professor Kevin Berrett, but that's not true. I am not, and I have never been a professor. I've been a lecturer, which is like a professor, only you have to do all the work for about 1/10 of the pay. And I've been that on and off for 4 or 5 years. I've been teaching literature, folklore, Islamic studies, Arabic, and similar topics at the University of Wisconsin since 1996, on and off, and literature and humanities at other colleges and universities in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Paris, France before that. So I'm just kind of an academic nebbish. But I'm qualified to talk about 9/11 because I've been studying the issue.
Okay, now weren't you, the story I remember hearing is they attempted to fire, the University of Wisconsin attempted to fire you because you spoke out on a radio station about 9/11, is that correct?
That's right, yeah. Well, I had been doing intensive 9/11 truth activism in the public spotlight actually since the beginning of 2004. And I brought David Griffin to Madison, Wisconsin, and filled up a 500-seat room, put it on national television in spring 2005 at the University of Wisconsin, the biggest classroom on campus. So it was hardly a secret that I was doing 9/11 activism. I was out there in the middle of the campus every anniversary doing a 14-hour 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. truth teach-in. I was out there in public doing stuff, for years, and I was very much tolerated. The only reaction I got from colleagues was stuff like, well, I think it looks like you're right. That was a few people, and others were things like, well, you might be right. I've been afraid to look into it because I'm afraid it might be true. Those were the kind of reactions I got for years. And then last year, the 9/11 Truth movement was picking up steam. We had scholars for 9/11 Truth with 100 full professor PhDs supporting 9/11 Truth, including a bunch of scientists. And the polls were showing the American people were more and more waking up to it being an inside job. And so I think the other side decided to try to find an academic whipping boy to make an example of. And lo and behold, they chose me. They first got Fetzer on Fox TV, Jim Fetzer, the founder of Scholars for 9/11 Truth, and he made mincemeat of Ollie North. So the Fox slunk away licking its wounds, looking for somebody to make an example of, and they Googled around and they found me. So I was then invited on a radio show. Jessica McBride, a right-wing Milwaukee talk radio host who works for the media monopoly in southeastern Wisconsin, the Journal Sentinel Company. Her husband is an up-and-coming Bushite Republican DA who was running for Attorney General, right? So very politically connected woman. She called me up at noon to invite me on her radio show. And she was very sweet and seductive, and, oh, I've heard so much about you. I've heard what you're doing. Could you please send me your syllabus, and, could you come on at 8 o'clock tonight? And I said, sure, whatever. So I got on at 8 o'clock, and she introduced me as this evil professor who's teaching his students horrible conspiracy theories. He's Wisconsin's Ward Churchill. Go ahead, Kevin. Tell us what you think happened on 9/11 and hang yourself. And so I told her, and this radio show is actually pretty amusing. It's become kind of a cult classic in 9/11 circles because she just gets more and more upset. I stay pretty calm, and she just gets angry and angrier, and finally she's screaming at me, "Is Osama an evil man?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I don't know even if he had anything to do with 9/11. Is he evil? Is he evil? Yes or no? Is he evil? Say he's evil." Professor Berrett won't say that Osama's evil. She's just out of control. So anyway, that radio show, I got off at 9 p.m. after an hour, and then she went from 9 to 10 p.m. apparently just, bashing me. And then the next morning, 9 a.m. the next morning, Steve Nass, the resident university basher in the Wisconsin State Legislature, issued a press release calling for me to be fired based on what I had said on this radio show the night before. Now, what's interesting is that he has subsequently said that he heard about this through Jessica McBride's blog. And if that were true, that means that she stayed up after 10 p.m. all night writing her blog, and Steve Nass stayed up all night reading the blog, and then by 9 a.m. he had his press release crafted. And that, he's not the world's fastest thinker, so I don't believe that for a minute. I think the whole thing was a setup. And in any case, there was a media firestorm, and I ended up all over the news.
Well, you weren't representing the university in any way, were you?
Well, that's what people often don't understand, is that professors are actually contractual agents. So what professors think does not reflect what the university thinks. Every professor has their own crazy ideas about something, and that's not the university's ideas. The university is only represented by official pronouncements from the administration. So, of course, what I have to say has nothing to do with the university's position on anything. But, of course, the other side is trying to pretend that it does.
Okay, so the discussion today, and we don't have a script today. From what you told me, we want to talk about the Islamic connection. Why the Islamic connection? You've studied this. I understand you have a website that really concentrates on this. Tell us a little bit about the connection and why you want to speak about that today.
Well, the website is actually the Muslim Jewish Christian Alliance for 9/11 Truth. And the purpose is to bring members of the three Abrahamic faith traditions together in dialogue about the facts and meaning of 9/11. And we don't just want people who are convinced it was an inside job. We'd like to have a dialogue with everybody in order to defuse this clash of civilizations or this crusade jihad that was launched or intensified by 9/11. So that's what the website is about. It's an interfaith dialogue and truth kind of program. But what I had suggested talking about today is somewhat different, which is the Islam globalization connection. And that's separate, but it's related to 9/11, I think. And, as I see it, 9/11 was a pretty over-the-top sort of affair in which top U.S. officials and presumably some top financial people behind them decided to blow up the World Trade Center and kill 3,000 people to create a new Pearl Harbor, as some of these people had called for 1 year before. Now that's over the top. I mean, we hadn't had anything quite that extreme before. And I think the reason that they resorted to such extreme measures was in part because the anti-globalization movement had been making immense progress in blocking this sort of financial takeover of the world that involves this sort of the top money people in the U.S., British, Israeli financial upper echelons essentially going in and mortgaging the world and then buying it up and then using military and covert power to punish people who don't go along with the program. You can read about this in Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. He describes how his job was to force or to convince heads of state to accept these massive loans that they would never be able to pay back. And when the countries went into default, these great financial houses that lent the money, the IMF people, Federal Reserve Bank people, those people would move in and then buy up all the resources of the countries at pennies on the dollar and just take over the country, basically. So that's how they're taking over the world. And if the heads of state refuse that offer, the so-called asteroids come in. These are CIA-linked hitmen, and they cause plane crashes and other modes of getting rid of pesky foreign leaders who don't go along with the program. So this is this world takeover thing that's been going on for quite a while, and 9/11, I think, was a response to the anti-globalization movement's success, in changing people's consciousness to resist this world takeover and to support local autonomy, individual autonomy, national autonomy, cultural autonomy. People should be able to hold on to their land, their resources, and their culture against the encroachment of these globalizers. And 9/11 was an attempt to break through the resistance of the anti-globalization movement in general and the Islamic resistance to globalization in particular. That's why we have a war on Islam now.
Let me just make clear to the audience something that you mentioned. We keep talking globalism. Now, this is kind of a new term back years ago when I started learning about this stuff. Basically, at the time, the other word they used to use is New World Order. And, of course, George Bush Sr. used that in public speeches before as well, and other people use that term too. But they've tended to want to change the terminology now. Is generally called globalization. And the basic idea behind it, and correct me if you have anything to add to this, the basic idea behind is certain powerful people, and I'm not even sure if I say countries, but certain powerful forces in the world it's been a worldwide dream of man in general to rule the world. And essentially what we're seeing here is certain powerful, really high-level people that are in power trying to work their way towards a one-world government where basically everything can be controlled from a more centralized position of power. In a nutshell, would you agree with that?
I think that's about right. And I think the term New World Order, though, the reason I use that, I would talk about globalization, anti-globalization, rather than New World Order in most cases.
They
is that,
demonize us.
well, yeah, if you say, yeah,
words now,
right,
so
if you say New World Order, they think you're a conspiracy theorist. That means I don't have to even consider what you have to say.
That's right.
Whereas the anti-globalization movement was making inroads among all sorts of people. And if you talk about, yeah, I'm with the anti-globalization movement, I don't like these forces of global capital taking over the world, then they say, oh, that sounds reasonable. It's language.
I use the term because there's a lot of people who might have been studying this sort of thing a long time. Well, of course, they would already know that the globalization is the new catchphrase for what used to be titled the New World Order. It's just we have found a better name for it, something that's not rejected yet in the press to use to demonize us, because when we pick out a name like that, they just try to totally demonize us with, say we're crazy conspiracy theorists.
Right. Well, it's quite the opposite. The globalization was originally launched as, that's a good thing, right? Bringing the world together. You can eat at all sorts of different ethnic restaurants now, and you couldn't. The world is getting closer. The internet brings us together. You can fly to any country you want, and all that sort of thing. The world's getting smaller. They were trying to make it sound good, and then the anti-globalization movement really just, exploded, and the resistance to this thing, became kind of chic, and so when you talk about being against globalization and allied to the anti-globalization movement, that still has a fairly positive connotation, which is wonderful. We kind of won that battle to a certain extent in the media, and we need to keep using that victory, and broaden our base, beyond the people who understand the New World Order. You realize that that's a small minority of people who get it as far as the New World Order and the secret societies and all that kind of stuff.
Well, except we're talking also these organizations that we have been taught all our lives that is so good and wonderful for this open world. This new socialism is really what it amounts to. United Nations, World Health Organization, IMF, all the treaties we've signed, NAFTA, GATT, and the FTAA, or FTA, the federal, I lost the trade agreement to make all the Central American countries and northern countries.
Yeah, there's NAFTA.
NAFTA, GATT, and then the FTAA, which is I can't remember what the
Free Trade Association Agreement.
Yeah, free trade. That's another another term to make us believe that this is all so wonderful. This thing we're moving into a worldwide. It's a worldwide socialist totalitarian form of government. I mean, based on my studies, what we're really heading for is worldwide socialism, socialist totalitarian. I mean, in fact, eventually.
Right, and you may be right. Again, for purposes of trying to craft the message so people get it, I avoid calling it socialism. Number one, because that's not entirely accurate. Like what I was just describing to you, the way that the World Bank takes over the resources of countries through this process of getting them into debt that they can't ever pay off, and then just moving in and taking the resources. That's not exactly socialism, because often these resources are public resources originally. That is, say the government of Brazil will own a lot of land, and the bankers from the U.S., British, Israeli axis will come in and take over that land for their own exploitation through free market capital. Of course, they're the ones that print the dollars, so they own the kind of the monetary unit that's being used. But ultimately, it's not exactly a step towards socialism to say privatize the water system of Sao Paulo, Brazil, so that private bankers can charge the people of Sao Paulo for their water supply, when previously it was a public resource and a public utility. In a sense, you could argue that that's moving the opposite direction from socialism, and a lot of people do. So I think rather than getting too much into this ideological battle of socialism versus free market capitalism, I think there's a more clear-headed way of seeing it is without forcing yourself into that ideological tunnel vision, and just see the larger picture of what's going on here. But I would argue, you're right though, I think that they're trying to break down barriers of autonomy among all sorts of barriers: individual autonomy and freedom, local autonomy and freedom, and state level autonomy and freedom in the U.S. and centralize it all. So they're looking for centralized dictatorship, but this is dictatorship, a finance dictatorship that is still using a certain amount of market capitalism as its way of controlling
and that also almost gets into what you could describe as fascism, even.
Yeah, I think fascism is a better word than socialism for what these people are doing, because they don't. Socialism has this connotation of trying to arrange things for the benefit of the ordinary people, and I don't think these people are doing that at all.
Okay, now the Islamic connection. Get into that. You've done a lot of study on it, and I must admit I haven't done as much study. Of course, we're told on September 11th these Arabs with box cutters, attacked us, and if you look back in history, Western societies have always demonized and basically attacked Middle Eastern nations and Islamic cultures for centuries. So, what's the connection you want to make here in relation to anti-globalism?
Well, it's true that there's a long history of kind of struggle between the Islamic world and the Christian West, meaning Western Europe. And that history is being re-invoked now to whip people up into this war fever and frenzy, to imagine that we're going to have to spend the rest of our lifetimes, in 100 years or whatever, fighting the Muslims. And geostrategically, that's just not true. That is, that the actual geostrategic struggle right now is not the people that are trying to take over the world. They're not worried about the military power of any of the Muslim countries. I mean, maybe they're a little worried that some of these countries might get a couple of nukes and thereby be able to have a little more influence over their own resources. That's true. But what they're really concerned about in the long run is any challenger arising that's able to challenge them militarily. And China would be one likely suspect. Russia is a likely suspect. And to some extent, there's a geopolitical battle by these forces against the euro being associated with Western European capital, and the dollar being associated with U.S., London, Israeli axis. So these are the real battles. Now, so why are they going after Islam then? The answer to that is that it's the Islamic cultures resist the financial cultural encroachment that these people are trying to accomplish, and that makes cuts these parts of the world off from total control.
I need to interrupt you for just a second. Lift up your microphone a little bit. We have to move this table forward. The table's actually smoking a little bit.
Oh,
we're sitting right next to a
we're having a hot conversation here.
Yeah,
the table
we're
is
sitting
smoking
right next to a fire, and the table is just heating up a little too much. So
okay.
We're still rolling. We're not going to stop here. Okay, continue. I'm sorry.
So I think that the real reason for this war on Islam that's going on is not that the Islamic world presents a military threat. It doesn't. No major Islamic country has any military resources to devote to going out and trying to conquer anybody, and there's no possibility of that arising within our lifetimes. No realistic possibility. So what are they afraid of? Well, what they're really afraid of is that the Islamic world will regain control of its own resources and keep its own cultural autonomy. And that would stop the forces of this axis of global capital from moving into these areas, getting control of the energy supplies, and making these places vassal states or imperial colonies, really.
Okay, but now you're basically speaking geographical location versus religious. Now, is there a distinction between the two, or are we just after their land, or we just hate, our Western societies hate Islamic religion?
Well, I don't think it has to do with hating the religion. I think it has to do with the cultural barriers that are associated with the religion. Cultural barriers to encroachment by the globalists' capital and their culture and basically their power. In traditional Islam, you're not allowed to lend at interest or to accept loans at interest. There's no interest. You can't charge interest. That torpedoes the entire Western banking system. Yeah. So if the global capitalists want to move in, say, and get a hold of the phosphate resources in Morocco's Sahara region, they would have to use their banking system to do it. And yet, if you're a Muslim in Morocco, you can't have anything to do with that banking system. Theoretically, you should expel it and make sure it can't operate in your country. So there's a cultural struggle between the people in the Islamic world who want to maintain their culture and their autonomy and their control of their own resources versus these globalizers who want to essentially invade and take control of the land and the resources and turn these people into peons and vassals. And part of the way of doing that is to brainwash them into accepting the Western culture and giving up their more Islamic culture. So it's a cultural thing involving power, and the religious angle is really secondary, I think.
So what about location now? The Middle East has always been the center of all sorts of worldwide hardships throughout man's history. So does the geographical location play a part in this too?
Well, I don't know about worldwide hardships, because from for the centuries prior to the Renaissance, the Islamic world was probably the most advanced part of the world. It was actually a very the leading city, the most cultivated, civilized city in the world in the Middle Ages was Cordoba, Spain, which was a Muslim city. It was the the jewel of the world in the eyes of the Western Christians that went there. So the history is actually fairly, it's not a painful, hard history really overall.
I guess I refer mainly to what is now the area known as Israel, if you want to call that as part of the Middle East. That has always been a hotbed of social issues for the beginning of man almost.
Well, I'm not sure that's the case. There was Israel, or Palestine fell to the Muslim armies fairly soon after the Islamic revelation that was in the 7th century. So it fell at the beginning of the 8th century. That was part of the Byzantine Empire, which was extremely onerous. The citizens of the Byzantine Empire were being taxed more and more, and they were in this endless losing struggle with the Persian Empire. The place was in bad shape, and these Muslim armies came in and really were supported by the population to a large extent, and that's why they were able to take it over so easily and with relatively little bloodshed. They expelled the Byzantine rulers, and the Muslim rulers then lived in tents and provided police and protection and encouraged the subjects to retain their religion. So the Jews remain Jews, the Christians remain Christians, and the overall rule in Palestine has been quite there haven't been major problems there for most of the history. There was a brief period of crusades when the Crusaders from the West came and slaughtered the entire population of Jerusalem and set up shop and run the place for parts of a couple of centuries. But the Jerusalem has been run by Muslims in a very peaceful and pretty prosperous manner, at least prosperous enough, since they took over. 1,200, 1,300 years ago. There have only been these brief interludes of strife and travail when crusaders, whether Christian crusaders in the Middle Ages or Zionist crusaders in our time, came and took the place over with massive bloodshed.
Okay, well, why are we always bombarded in the press? We're basically taught to hate Middle Eastern countries, Middle Eastern peoples, Middle Eastern religions, and essentially Islamic religions. What anything to say about the connection there? Why are they pushing us to hate these people?
Well, as I said, there is this obstacle, a cultural barrier to the takeover of the world by the forces of globalization in the Islamic world. So that's a lot of it. And so when the Cold War ended and the great dichotomy of the free capitalist world versus the enslaved communist world was over, now there's no more excuse for to steal your tax money, right? The people that run this empire no longer have this enemy that they can use to scare the people into giving up their blood and treasure to these imperial global takeover projects. So they had to invent a new enemy. And they looked around and they chose the Muslims because, well, number one, there is a lot of Zionist power in the U.S., British, Israeli financial empire. And by Zionist power, what I mean is powerful people are very committed to the idea of this settler colonial Jewish state in Palestine that we call Israel. They're very ideologically committed to that. So such people naturally hate and fear Muslims because they came and colonized and expelled and ethnic cleansed and murdered, a lot of Muslims, and the Muslims are resisting this. So naturally they don't like Muslims, just as the French settler colonialists who did the same thing in Algeria don't like Muslims or didn't like Muslims. And so there's this ideological thing from the Zionists that leads to wanting to make the Muslims the big enemy. And then also, as I was saying, the Islamic world is huge. Muslim countries go from northwest Africa all the way across the belt of the biggest, continent of the world, the Eurasian continent, all the way out to Malaysia and Indonesia. It's a huge chunk of the world that's got major Muslim influence. So the globalizers want to seize control of all that land and all those resources, especially the energy resources. Almost all of the world's remaining energy resources, with a couple of exceptions like Venezuela, are under Muslim soil, and the globalizers need control of those resources to rule the world. So for all of these reasons, making Muslims the next great enemy was the logical choice. And so they did that. They started doing it even before 9/11, and then they created this bogus Islamic terrorist attack on 9/11 in order to demonize Muslims and make Islam the next great enemy.
Okay, so the Islamic nations, okay, you said it's stretching all the way from North Africa all the way throughout southern, well, most of Asia probably. Do they have the same ideology about the banking system, the no interest, for instance?
It's very clear in Islamic doctrine that you can't use interest in money lending.
And I also know some of these countries I've heard in the past have already done it or attempted to back their currency, at least partially, by gold. Is that pretty much also a standard that's being done all throughout these Islamic nations?
There is a movement to do that. And the thing about Muslims is that they're, Muslims are said to be so wild-eyed and extremist and ready to sacrifice themselves for a bunch of virgins in paradise and all that. But the reality is that Muslims are generally very cautious, moderate kinds of people. And so even though they know that they're not supposed to use interest and that it would be a good idea to back their currency with gold, in general, Muslims look at Western power coming at them with guns and stuff, and they say, well, it's better to just compromise and be moderate. So unfortunately, from my perspective, the movement to dump the dollar and dump the euro and go back to a gold standard as a standard currency for the whole Islamic world has it's made progress, but it's not going to happen anytime real soon, as far as I can tell. But but everybody agrees it'd be a great idea. It's just, can we really do it? It's so radical, and the globalists will kill us if we try.
The reason I bring it up is because when you mentioned the money possibly being that. When you mess with the money, that is a big deal for these globalists. Well,
sure. That's why they smashed Iraq, because Iraq was going off the dollar onto the euro, and then they're going to smash Iran for the same reason. And it's interesting though, this movement to use a gold currency is big in Malaysia, of all places. Malaysia, I think, that's where the smart Muslims are thinking about these things. How are we going to regain our autonomy? And these people are pretty savvy. This Mahathir Mohamad guy, former prime minister there, who's actually had some pretty extensive conversations with William Rodriguez, the 9/11 hero that we just had here. He's totally hip to this, and a lot of folks in Malaysia are hip to this. And so, if this new Islamic gold dinar ever happens, it may very well start out of Malaysia.
I'm going to take a small break here just to reintroduce our audience. We are at about the half-hour point of the show. And what you're watching is a show called Forbidden Knowledge. I generally like to point this time. Sometimes I show a clip or something if I have it to try to catch the channel surfers, so you keep them from, if they're looking for something to watch, maybe they'll stop at a reality show instead of a non-reality show. But anyway, we have with me today a guest, Dr. Kevin Berrett. And the next thing I want to ask you is about the Muslim countries. You've done a lot of traveling. I think I heard you mention you're going to Morocco here in a few weeks. What are some of the countries you've been to, and I want to get an idea of the people of these nations, how they really feel about Americans, not about our government, but about Americans, because I know that a lot of people in this country, most of us who really have any idea what's going on, don't really hate the Islamic people or Middle Eastern people in the Middle East, other than the ones that believe what they're told on TV we're supposed to hate them. Do people there have a better understanding of what's really going on and have actually a liking to Americans and maybe just against our government? You understand the distinction.
Oh yeah, I haven't traveled all that much. I've been to Central America, I've been to Europe, and the only Islamic country I've been to is Morocco. But the people of Morocco very much, when I was there at least, they had a very positive image of America. Everybody wanted to come here. But they had, a lot of them are very skeptical about the U.S. government. And the one thing that really sticks in the craw of most Muslims around the world regarding the U.S. government is its overwhelming support for Israel. Most Muslims would like to see a more neutral policy. They don't really see why Americans should be, why have Americans given hundreds of billions of dollars to Israel? Why are they providing these attack helicopters that are used to mow down civilians and blow up whole houses to sort of, to kill like some target? They're killing like 30 people to get at one guy that they want to get. And, they shoot children for sport. I mean, I hate to say this is not a blood libel, this is fact. The British Medical Journal published an article a couple of years ago studying 600 sniper killings of children in Israel, and concluded that children are routinely shot at school playgrounds, walking to and from school, and so on, just for no particular reason. And we have eyewitness accounts from Chris Hedges, former New York Times journalist, in his article Gaza Diary from Harper's Magazine about 4 years ago, which he describes these Israeli soldiers getting on megaphones and luring Palestinian children out of their houses with taunts and then gut shooting them. And Hedges says, I've covered war zones before, I've seen horrible things in the Balkans and so on, but never before have I seen soldiers luring children into the range of their guns and shooting them for sport. So the Muslims see all this on TV, and this is really why there is such strong anti-Israeli feeling, is really because of these atrocities, plus the fact that it's historically, clearly the Israelis are the aggressors. They came in and stole this land, ethnic cleansed the population, and there's just no justification for that in the eyes of Muslims. And the notion that Holocaust justifies Israel is seen as a completely ludicrous myth, because the Palestinians didn't do the Holocaust. There's absolutely no connection. If it justifies a Jewish state, it justifies a Jewish state in Germany, not in Palestine. So that's the Muslim viewpoint on this, and that's the thing that really bothers Muslims, I think, about the U.S. is this overwhelming support for these atrocities going on in Israel.
What about talk about more about 9/11? We were supposedly attacked by these box cutters that were Arabs, and I get a lot of comments from people that the negative names, the people who don't really understand what's going on. They call them towel heads, they call them all these names, they got demonizing names, really, to try and make it look like this is the enemy. Of course, some of us know better. What about September 11th? Okay, this was done to get us more towards globalization, and to talk more in detail why you think it was connecting to why the Arabs, first of all, and why. I'm trying to think back in the other ones. Pearl Harbor. We took the example of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor goes back to the Japanese. Now, the Japanese really did attack us, although we knew well ahead of time that they were going to attack us. This time, they've blamed on these Arabs, and it certainly appears by all the evidence that there was a whole lot more that was known way before September 11th about what really was going down, but yet it was blamed on these Arabs. So why pick something like this, and why now?
Well, as I said, the forces that are trying to take over the world, we're facing roadblocks with Islamic culture. The religion is getting, there's a movement towards more intense religious belief and expression in the Islamic world, which puts a bigger block against capital. There was also the desire to invade Afghanistan and put through a U.S.-controlled oil pipeline, or a gas pipeline rather, and get a hold of the Caspian Sea energy resources. And they were thinking that there were huge oil resources there. Now it turns out they may not be quite as big as they thought. So they wanted an excuse to go into Afghanistan, and they wanted an excuse to go into Iraq. Both of these wars had been on the drafting boards since the late 90s, even before that in a way, but they were very seriously planned by the late 90s. And to get these wars, they needed to demonize an enemy in order to whip the population up into a hysteria where it would be willing to, to shed blood and throw away treasure in this quest for, invading these countries. So you have to create an enemy image, to make people angry. And so the enemy image that they chose was Arabs/Muslims, because, Afghanistan, they're Muslims, and in Iraq, they're Arabs, and the plan was, of course, to keep fighting in these regions for a century. They've told us this, the war that will not end in our lifetime.
And of course, we've seen moves towards demonizing Iran big time. That's right now, that's the main one. I think Syria has been mentioned. What were the evils, Axis, that Bush called?
Right. Well, the axis of evil, that was David Frum, a leading neocon, came up with that phrase.
Oh,
that was Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. They threw North Korea in there just to make it look like it wasn't a war on Islam, I think.
Okay.
But North Korea went ahead and just they snubbed their nose at everybody, and they just built their nukes, and nobody cares. So it's not a very convincing pretense that the axis of evil is anything other than Islam. And of course, as I said, it's not that they hate Islam as a religion, although they do. But it's more that the culture of Islam stands in the way of their world takeover attempt.
Well, interestingly enough, if you study, when you talk about religions, and I don't like to talk about religion on the show very often, but when you study the religion that these people apparently believe in, Christianity is even rather disgusting to them because they think it's a bastardization of their own religion. When you look into the mystery schools and all the secret societies and what they actually believe in, and it's generally regarded that these higher level people that are really trying to control things get more involved. Bohemian Grove, they have these religious ceremonies, if you will, that are really, it's not like the original religion. I don't know if you study this much, where it gets back even before Christianity, Islamic religions, and even Buddhist types of religions. It gets back like the dawn of man, where they study these things. Do you know anything about that, and why would we be favorable to Christians, although this is considered largely a Christian society, and against Muslims? Islamic society.
Well, I haven't closely studied these mystery schools that you're talking about. I'm sort of a neophyte to all of that. But as I understand it, the neoconservatives, I have studied them a little bit, and they're atheists. They believe that religion, like all ethical discourse, is an illusion that is created to control the masses. So, they go back to Plato and Aristotle, and they claim that when Plato talks about the good, that's all just lies to bamboozle the masses, and that Plato had a secret teaching, which was that what's good for me is bad for you, and vice versa. So they believe that we neoconservatives, who are strong enough to see that there's no such thing as good in the world, and everybody is actually evil and out for themselves, and we can admit that, and then we can use lies, the lie of the good and the lie of God, the lie that there's anything beyond this power struggle. We use that to control the masses, and that is our right and our duty. And so it's a very sort of Hitler-style philosophy, really, of big force and big lies, and that's what their contribution to this situation is. As far as the other weird religious offshoots, Masonry and cults and all that, some people think there's, for instance, a Satanist cult that's operating at some level, some serious power at high echelons of the U.S. Army, for example. There's stories about Moffett Air Force Base in Nebraska being the head of a pedophile, child-sacrificing, evil satanic cult that may be linked to some of what goes on at Bohemian Grove and so on and so forth. Well, I've seen a little bit of that. I have no idea to what extent it's true, but I think that there's an element in Western culture, neocons are part of it, that's trying to transgress all limits and transgress all bounds. This sort of satanic, post John Milton, Satan being the hero in Paradise Lost kind of thing. That romantic movement had that. This whole intellectual school that says smash all the limitations and the boundaries, destroy tradition, go beyond this Promethean, Nietzschean kind of ideas. And I think our elite is very much influenced by that, and so that would make them hate all traditional religions and want to obliterate them, and that may contribute to their war on Islam. Islam being the last traditional religion that's really got some staying power.
Now, worldwide numbers, is Islamic religion, is this about the third largest? I think Buddhism is number one.
No, I think Islam is number two. Well, it depends how you categorize it. But as I understand,
so Christianity would be third. You believe?
No, Christianity is number one, actually. As far as actual practicing religious people or people who consider it their identity, last I checked, I thought Christianity was the biggest and Islam was second, with Buddhism third. Oh,
Buddhism. Okay, I thought Buddhism was number one. I'm sorry. Then
I could be wrong. I mean, and again, it depends on how you categorize people, but I'm pretty sure that that's the usual religious studies statistic, is that Christianity is well ahead. The usual statistic for number of Muslims in the world is about somewhere between a billion and 1.5 billion right now.
Does anybody, we have a little local studio audience here of about 6 people and 2 dogs, and that's the little growling you've been hearing. Does anybody have a question they'd like to throw out? There's one in the back. What's your question?
There are many different types of Islam as well, and they're not all, Islam as a religion is not a unified religion, and they're, or even in Iraq right now, there are 3 fighting sections, I guess is the best way to call it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Kind of, the audience couldn't hear it. Could you?
Right. Yeah. The question was, Islam is not unified one religion, but there are different sects, such as 3 sects fighting in Iraq right now. And actually, no, there are 2 sort of things that could be called sects in Iraq right now, which is Sunni Islam, and about 90% of the world's Muslims consider themselves Sunnis. And then there's the Shiite version of Islam, and about 10% of the world's Muslims consider themselves Shiites. And in fact, these differences have been exaggerated, and we often compare this to the Reformation and the wars of the Reformation between the Catholics and the Protestants. Actually, the differences in belief between these 2 so-called sects are very small. It's hardly consequential. And the differences in the ritual are not even very great. So the actual differences between Sunnis and Shiites are pretty minor. But it ties in with ethnicity to a certain extent. People's ethnic identities get tied into their version of Islam, and so that's been exploited by the occupiers to try to divide the people of Iraq and other places by Sunni Shiite schism. Most of the people who lived in Iraq before this most recent Gulf War say that they didn't even know who was Sunni and who was Shiite. They didn't care. There's all sorts of intermarriage. There's really no even consciousness of there being any difference. There were lots of Shiites fighting for Saddam. Saddam's army that fought the Iranians, who were mostly Shiites, was full of Shiites. So these things didn't break down on a Sunni Shiite level prior to what's happened now. What's happened now is that, as I see it, false flag operations on a grand scale by the occupation and, of course, their Israeli allies have been, they've been blowing up hundreds of people at a time in these massive bombings in mosques and markets. And these have been, all sorts of propaganda has gone into trying to say that these are Sunnis blowing up Shiites and Shiites blowing up Sunnis. In most cases, it's the occupation blowing up Iraqis. Most Iraqis realize this, but there are a few who don't. And of course, Al-Qaeda, which is really Al-CIA, they're mercenaries who, run by U.S.-run mercenaries who are brought in there to do these anti-Shiite bombings. And this has stirred up a certain amount of strife between, people who consider themselves Sunnis and people who consider themselves Shiites. Like all the world's Sunnis practically love Hezbollah, for instance. Hezbollah is a Shiite organization supported by Iran. But they're the most popular Islamic group anywhere, including among Sunnis here in the U.S. At least those who are politically aware and not, watching Fox News.
What about okay? Let's say these powers to be, let's just call them. What if they get their way? What do you foresee in relation to the Middle East and Islamic religions in general? What do you foresee as obviously speculation on your part, but what do you see that would actually happen?
Well, I think they would just like to get complete control of the key land with the oil resources.
And that's happening as we speak.
Well, yeah, and they'll do it however they have to. If these places just gave up and said, yeah, you can come in and rule us, and we'll do whatever you say, that'd be fine with them. That's probably not going to happen. So instead, they're going to have to come in and poison the entire region with depleted uranium and basically exterminate the people. Kill off a huge number of the people and just destroy the society and destroy its infrastructure.
And that's happening already too.
Well, that's what they're doing in Iraq. And then once there are no more people there who can organize a resistance, then they can just take the oil out.
And what about religion? How does religion play? What do you foresee happens to religion?
I don't think the people doing this care very much about religion. Although I think they're a little bit frightened that Islam could keep spreading in Europe and even in the U.S. and that Islamic culture could become more powerful than their financial strings that they're using to control the world, and that would scare them. But no, I don't think that the religious element is really very important. I think it's the geostrategy. I think these guys who are in charge now, if converting people to Islam could be used to control people, they would be running around, they would be the biggest pro-Muslims on the planet. They're just trying to control people by whatever means they can, and they think religion is just a brainwashing system for them to use. So.
And it does appear that to be that way in this country. Well, it's my opinion, but most religions are a form of brainwashing to a lot of different people who don't study their own religion even.
Right, and these globalists, they're promoting moderate Islam. But what moderate Islam is Islam that's really it's so watered down that it's those such people are just good subjects of the financial empire, just like everybody else.
So it's like a combination. one of the things I've heard, one of the biggest theories as far as this globalization goes, is basically a one world religion as well, or one so watered down, as you might say, that they can all, it's hard to even tell the distinctions between them.
Yeah, I think watered down to the point that there's no more initiative left in these local religions to resist the global control system. Yeah.
Does anybody else in the audience have a question they'd like to pose to Mr. Kevin Berrett?
So for these globalists, the United States is almost like just one of many bases, and possibly 9/11 could be a good sign that if you're anti-globalization, you're under attack too, just as the anti-globalists in the Middle East are under attack. It's more an ideological attack on any front that isn't part of the agenda. Doesn't matter where you are.
Absolutely, yeah. Just as the Islamic world puts up resistance to control by global capital through various forms, not just through the religion. Saddam Hussein is, he was very much of a secularist, and he was using secular socialism as an excuse to nationalize the oil resources and use the money from his oil resources on behalf of his people through building an educational system, a healthcare system, roads, and a stronger military, and that was what was threatening to the globalizers, because he was churning out PhDs in nuclear physics and stuff like that, and his Iraq was up to a European standard of living practically, despite the wars he got him into. So that was his crime, and that was just as bad as being Muslim. Anything that gets in their way. Hugo Chavez and his brand of sort of populist socialism in Venezuela is equally dangerous to them. So they're just going after whatever gets in their way, and Islam is really being used almost more as an one-size-fits-all enemy image to justify aggression in this huge part of the world that's Muslim, rather than an actual real thing that's there that's necessary to attack.
There's another question. Go ahead.
Well, now that it looks like the 9/11 truth movement is going to be successful in the United States, what do you think the impact is going to be here?
Right. Well, what's the impact of the success of the 9/11 truth movement? Well, I think we've already busted the myth of 9/11. Philip Zelikow, the guy who wrote the 9/11 Commission report, almost single-handedly controlled the whole investigation. He described himself as a specialist in the creation and maintenance of public myths, such as the perfidious Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that changed our history. And he was trying to create a public myth that would be a sacred story that couldn't be questioned. And as long as it's a sacred story and anybody questions it as a heretic, it's still functioning as a myth that can mobilize a whole population. And the 9/11 truth movement has already busted the myth. It's no longer a myth. The official story of 9/11 is now a legend, which is a story that may or may not be true, that actually when you tell the story, you're staging a debate on whether it's real or not, or true or not. The polls showed this, that 36% of the American people say it was an inside job, 16% believe the government's telling the truth, and everybody else is in the middle somewhere. So it's no longer a myth. It's now just a legend. And so we've succeeded, and we've destroyed their mobilization myth that was going to be used for this 100-year war. So we've already pulled the rug out from under them to a very great extent. They're presumably worried about whether they could try to revitalize this through more false flag attacks or not. And assuming we continue this movement towards success, I think we could actually have a significant change in the power relations in this country. We could take it back from the globalizers, and we could certainly unseat and prosecute the neocons. 9/11 truth could be the key to radically changing this whole historical picture that we've been talking about.
Well, how can we take it back? We're doing our best to wake people up, and as you say, already majority of people already know there's something at least wrong with the story. How can we take it back other than waking up our fellow neighbor?
Well, that's the main thing, is waking people up. So the question is how to wake people up, and then how to mobilize them once they're awake. Once you're awake, what do? Do you just sit around being depressed, or do you take some kind of more constructive action, such as waking other people up in various ways?
I've heard that a lot of people feel that if it becomes publicly known that this was an inside job, okay, the economy's going to fall, the stock market will crash, social chaos will ensue. What do you say to that?
Okay, the question is if the public authorities admit that 9/11 was an inside job and it becomes accepted, will that crash the economy and destroy our way of life? I don't think so, not necessarily. It kind of depends. If that happens, it won't be because of 9/11 truth. Our economy is already ready for a huge crash, right? We're printing up green paper and trading it for real goods and services. And how long are the Chinese and other people making our stuff going to keep taking green paper that's backed by nothing for the stuff they give us? So we're ripe for a crash, and maybe they'll blame it on 9/11 truth. They could try that, but it wouldn't be 9/11 truth that did that. Perceptions about things like 9/11 only have a certain amount of effect on things, and sure, they could give it a push in the direction of a momentary economic downturn, but 9/11 truth isn't going to eliminate our economic infrastructure. That's already been done by the globalists. They already shipped it overseas, and they're trying to print their green paper and trade that for real goods and services. And 9/11 truth in itself isn't going to doom that project. That project is already doomed because nobody's dumb enough to take unbacked green paper for real goods and services forever.
Or they could use an economic collapse as a pretense for, not even a pretense, just for the distraction of people finding out about September 11th. Things could become so bad in this country, in fact, with an economic collapse, that we take everybody's mind off that, and we have more pressing issues than to actually bring people to trial for their complicity in 9/11.
Oh yeah, there's a real danger of out-and-out fascism, that's for sure. And various scenarios could be economic collapse, perhaps in conjunction with a military disaster. And these guys seem to be pushing us towards military disaster. Webster Tarpley is concerned that the Iranian or the Iraqi resistance could cut off the southern supply routes to Baghdad, and thereby just decimate the American forces that are being surging into Baghdad to be concentrated there to no purpose other than to get slaughtered if the supply lines get cut. So something like that plus an economic crisis could put us into all-out fascism. And I mean it's not a given that's going to happen, but it's a real danger.
We do have another question.
When you look at the Iraq War and you look at how horribly all the soldiers have technically been treated in terms of how our government has treated them, I feel as if you were to get the military on your side, you would have a chance.
Yeah,
it's the military.
9/11 truth definitely needs to get the military on its side, and it's got the potential to do that in a way no other anti-war movement in the history has, because military people can't really be anti-war. That's a contradiction in terms. I mean, they can be skeptical about war, but they have to deep down inside say, well, sometimes you need to fight war. That's our job. But with 9/11 truth, we're not, just saying, no war ever or anything like that, or we're not going against their patriotism. We're appealing to their patriotism and saying, look, you guys all, like I did as a university teacher, we all took this oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And when has there been a more evil domestic enemy than these guys who hijacked our military system in order to blow up the World Trade Center and kill 3,000 Americans? That is the most egregious form of high treason that you could imagine. And military guys are getting it, and they can get it, and more of them are. If you go to patriotsquestion911.com, you'll get 100 former high-level military, intelligence, and government officials all pushing 9/11 truth. And there are more every day. It's like every day I hear about a new military officer, retired officer coming out on this. So yeah, I think that's getting the military on our side is key. And they are being, our soldiers are being brutally treated, poisoned with depleted uranium, and more military people are realizing how badly they've been used by these lunatics in power, and hopefully that'll be part of the solution.
And I must add, it's not only the military, but it's also police and other law enforcement too. Other question.
There's actually a West Point 9/11 Truth Group. Have you heard of them?
Really, a 9/11 Truth Group at West Point.
No, it's not at West Point. It's 9/11 Truth for West Point grads.
Oh, okay. West Point grads for 9/11 Truth sounds like a good group.
Any other questions?
I would just say that at a large conference, if you had several military officers there, I mean, the last conference I went to yesterday, there seemed to be a military presence, and people that had served, at least in previous wars, were there, and there's an element that should be recognized, and I think a lot more people would pay attention if you had military officials there.
Right. Well, we have that long list of former military officers at patriotsquestion911.com, and I try and bring these guys on my radio show sometimes. I had Doug Rocky on there the other night, Doug Rockey was the leading depleted uranium specialist in charge of the cleanup after Gulf War I in Iraq, and he worked through the mid-90s on DU for the Army until he saw just how bad it was and how they were completely covering it up and not giving treatment, not even admitting that this existed. And so now he's going around, screaming to everybody who will listen that, half the people who went over to Gulf War I at age 20 are disabled now, 15 years later, based on DU and other toxins they were exposed to. And so he's just fighting that. And he also knows about 9/11. He indicates he might even know the people that blew up the World Trade Center, because there are only very few military specialists capable of working on something like that, and he's just fighting mad and telling the truth to anybody who will listen. And there are a lot of military people who are getting to that point. If you go to patriotsquestion911.com, you'll hear what some of them have to say, and we do need to get them to come out and talk in public.
Isn't there quite a danger though, and fear on their parts to even speak out, even if they do know?
Well, sure. Doug has had he's had all sorts of harassment, but his attitude is that he's serving his country, and he's going to finish the job that he started when he was trying to clean up DU and deal with the DU problem. And so these military guys tend to be fairly brave. I mean, you are taught to be willing to put your life in danger for what's right when you go into the military, and so they're not the ones I would be concerned about wimping out as much as the civilians. Actually, it's the university professors who are the most cowardly lot in existence. I mean, so many of them know, and so many of them are afraid to talk, even when they have tenure. How much worse of a coward can you possibly be than a university professor with tenure who won't speak out about 9/11? That's pathetic.
We're almost out of time, but I might add also, okay, now that he's decided to actually take his oath of office seriously, then, if he's trying to protect and defend the country against enemies, foreign and domestic. But I might add though that, and this is kind of disturbing to a lot of people, but in reality there is no war. We haven't been at war since World War II, and so if you think about it, and I don't have anything against the military, but everyone that's serving right now has a moral obligation to realize, okay, they've taken oath of office, and the military code of conduct suggests that they are not supposed to take unlawful orders, but yet they're over there involved in this incursion, or whatever you might want to call it, because there is no war. And so in essence, everybody in the military really has to make that decision in time, if something really does happen major in this country, about whether they're truly going to take their oath of office to heart. Because, I mean, that's disturbing to think about, but the way this country was set up, it really wasn't set up for a standing army to begin with. It was really set up for just the National Guard, and to protect our boundaries, protect our borders.
Yeah, Doug Rockey actually made that point very eloquently the other night on the radio show. He said that, he signed in to the military to protect the Constitution and protect the borders, protect the country, defend the country. And he looks at our history and he says, there hasn't really been a war where we were defending the country since the War of 1812.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's just it's a little disturbing, and I take hard-hitting issues on this show, folks. In essence, our military, although I wish they'd just come home and protect our own country, because our country is in trouble. Although we aren't really in danger of being invaded by a foreign country at this point, the point is that we need our National Guard and Navy, and back then, and now we have an Air Force, of course. Back when the Constitution was written, we didn't have an Air Force. It was designed to protect our country, not to be out invading foreign lands, which is all we've ever really done since, like I say, since 1812. So it's been our hour's just about up. I do have to sign off, but I really thank Mr. Kevin Berrett for being here. He's traveled all the way from Wisconsin to be here with us today, and it's nice to have somebody to talk about these issues that we don't get anywhere else on this TV. We have 70 other channels on this TV that they're watching, and nothing else really comparable to watch. Except on public access here, and while I do hope other people get involved in public access, we could actually, the press is very, lies to us all the time, it's like complicit in the agenda, if you will. And so we could actually take over this station. All you have to do is sign up, the classes are free, you can get on the air free, and although it costs a little bit when we damage equipment, like I just happened to, that's why we only had 2 cameras today, folks, we actually damaged equipment, but it's free otherwise. It's free to make these shows and get on the air, and you can actually literally take over this station if we get enough patriots out there who really want to speak up. But the problem is most people are scared. And that's why I'm here. I'm sticking my neck out, and I get my neck stomped on occasionally, but we're going to continue on doing it. My name's Craig. I've got to get out of here. You've been watching a show called Forbidden Knowledge, shown every week at this time. Please join us again next time. So long.
Some people hate because there's money to make. Their faces on TV, the action news break. Just for a moment if they'd open their eyes, they'd understand and they could see through the lies. They demonize, they ridicule and berate. They show contempt before they examinate. They say they're righteous, but they live like a sleaze. They lie and slander, and they do it with ease. It's up to us to show the others the way. Set the example, we can do that today. Show all our countrymen we've nothing to hide. We've got the Constitution on our side. Next time you're told that there are people to hate, to know your foe you must investigate. You just might find out somewhere somebody lied. You could discover that you're on the wrong side. Sometimes we all have got to swallow our pride. We've got the Constitution on our side.